if, like me, you have a passion for history or study history, you know that it can bring out a whole lot of feelings and emotions. So sometimes it makes us happy, sometimes it makes us sad, sometimes it's insightful, sometimes we're really angered by it. And sometimes it can be funny. But the story, or the wee bit of history that I'm going to relate today, I find absolutely hilarious. And I don't mean any disrespect for the people that lived through it. I'm sure it was quite tense for them. But if you've ever heard the saying, "gone hog wild," well, my story today is about a pig, a dead pig, and how that dead pig brings the United States of America and Great Britain to the cusp of their third conflict. And you can imagine Great Britain, they're still a little peeved over that American Revolution thing. So they've lost the colonies, and it's not too many years later when, under the James Madison administration, that they declare war on Great Britain in the War of 1812. And that's just like scratching the scab right off a wound. So that kind of sets the picture. And there's quite a bit of backstory before I get to how this pig brings this all about. And it sort of starts with America in terms of their growth. They're becoming one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful nation on the planet. They coined the phrase manifest destiny in the 1840s. And a lot of Americans buy into that concept. So they're not only growing in power, but they've grown in size exponentially. We have the Louisiana Purchase, which doubles the size of the nation. Then they annex Texas, they annex California, they annex, or not annex, but take great parts of Mexico. They're now at war with the indigenous peoples on the plains and anywhere west of the Mississippi. And so there's a lot of conflict happening in America, but they are getting stronger as a nation. So both Americans and British North Americans are very suspect of one another and make efforts to defend, because they I guess they believe that, you know, it can all happen again. This bloodshed could start all over again. And neither London nor Washington want or need another war. So a lot of the disputes are resolved. In 1818, they established the 49th parallel. And that boundary line between our two nations, Canada, now Canada, and the United States, starts in Lake of the Woods area, so the boundary waters of Minnesota on one side, Ontario on this side, and it runs in a straight line until it hits the Rockies. But west of the Rockies, well, that's very disputed land. So from the very southern boundary of Oregon right to the northern tip of the Yukon, it has been inhabited by both British and Americans since the early 1800s. So at this point, they reestablished the 49th parallel on the west side of the Rockies, but they exempt Vancouver Island because it juts out. And I'm going to show a map of this disputed area. So you'll see in the map that there's a solid line and there's a dotted line. Now, the area in between is the disputed area, and both countries see it as a strategic area for defense of their sovereignty, which leads us to the pig. So both the British and the Americans see the San Juan Islands, and the largest one being San Juan Island itself, strategically important for defense in case of invasion. So what do the I'm getting ahead of myself. So what do the British do when they're threatened? Well, they build a Hudson Bay post. And that's what they did on San Juan Island. But the concern went so far as that Captain James Prevost in 1856 writes a letter back to England saying that the loss of the San Juan Islands would have a detrimental effect on Her Majesty's holdings in the West. And now we finally get to the pig. So enter into the picture a fellow by the name of Lyman Cutler. And he's a gold seeker. And, well, he hadn't had much luck. He kind of sucks at that trade, so he thinks, well, I'll take up farming. He makes his way south. I think he's somewhere up in the British Columbia area or the Yukon area for a while. Makes his way south to the San Juan Islands and thinks, I'll give my hand at farming a chance. Well, turns out he's pretty successful at it. But now the Hudson Bay Company, who are raising sheep primarily, but they have a number of pigs, and the pigs are constantly getting into Cutler's crops. And repeatedly he shoos them off, repeatedly. And he's getting pretty frustrated at this. And one morning he wakes up, and I think it's June, the date slips my mind, but 1856, I believe. He wakes up in the morning and he sees this big old Berkshire hog in his vegetable garden. Well, he's had enough. Back into his cabin, he loads up his old flintlock. He comes up and he kills that pig dead right there in his garden. But then he got pondering it. And he thought, well, perhaps my reaction was a little hasty, a wee bit harsh. So he thinks, well, I better make amends. So he wanders on down to the Hudson Bay Post and seeks out the authorities, and he takes blame for the pig. He says, I've shot your pig, it's in my garden, I've been trying to shoo him off, and well, now the story this is where the story starts to build into the conflict between the two countries. So the fellow in charge of the Hudson Bay Post, he's a fellow by the name of Charles Griffin, and to set the stage a little here, he's been kind of, or feels he's been marooned on this island forever, quite a long spell, and he totally feels it's below his stature. Anyway, he literally loses it. I mean, this guy flies off the handle, and he says to Cutler, he says, I want $100 for the hog. And Cutler goes, well, on a good day, the hog ain't worth $8. But so at this point, Cutler flies into a rage and he says, I ain't give you a darn cent for that hog. And he marches away. Day passes and Griffin sends in a couple of his Hudson Bay fellows, a few of them actually, with firearms to order payment from Cutler. Cutler's waiting at the garden gate with his loaded musket, and so we have what you might call the first standoff of the Pig Wars. At this point, we're going to see a couple of other characters enter the fray. The first one is a William S. Actually, it's Brigadier William S. Herney, and he's in charge of the Oregon Territory. But to give you an idea of what he's like, he's been court-martialed 4 times for rash decisions, for insubordination. He's hot-headed. He's simply an angry man. And they send him in to squash this small dispute over the hog. And that would be just like me taking my powder horn off the wall and throwing it into that fire. So he sends a small group of soldiers to the island under the command of a George Pickett. And yes, the same very George Pickett that a number of years later will lead the famous charge at the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, the British really see this as a threat, particularly Governor Douglas, who's the governor of the BC Territory. So he approaches, he sends a letter off to the British Navy saying that they've got to come in and protect British sovereignty on the island. He's gone so far in the past, Douglas that is, to issue free land grants to any British citizen to settle on San Juan Island because he wants to have this. He wants this to protect. He's deathly afraid of American invasion. So to the rescue, the British Navy show up. In fact, 5 warships with a total of, I believe it's 82 guns, and they just anchor off the shore of San Juan Island, and they're looking directly at Prickett's encampment. Prickett realizes, well, this was a bad choice. So he's hastily trying to retreat and entrench. And now the hot-headed Herney, he decides, well, I'm going to send in more reinforcements. So he sends a ship with 400 or so men. And the British Navy, this is actually a quote from one of the captains or one of the commanders on one of the ships. He says, we should blow them out of the water. But calmer heads prevail, and they decide that nobody wanted to be the first to fire the first shot that may start this third conflict. So Brickett's got approximately 500 men. They're entrenched, and we have our second standoff of the Pig Wars. one has to appreciate how slow news travels in this time period. So it takes news of all this business getting to Washington approximately 4 weeks, and about 6 to 7 to get to London. Now, two things happen at this point. Buchanan, who doesn't want this war, dispatches Winfield Scott. He's the overall commander of the army. At the same time, the British government get Rear Commander Rear Admiral Robert Bain, who's been in Peru to move forward. He's got an 82-gun ship. So we've got the so-called peace negotiator en route, and we've got the British Navy fortifying. And it's interesting, Scott happens to absolutely hate Harney, and Harney, Brigadier General Harney, hates him. In fact, Scott had court-martialed him once for insubordination. So, I mean, you can't make stuff like this up. This is history, and that's why it's so much fun. So Scott arrives, and now to give you a physical image of the man, he's 5'6" in stature. He weighs 385 pounds. He suffers from gout, dropsy, and he's recently broken his collarbone by falling off a horse. And I don't know about you, but I'd like to see the size of that horse. Anyway, he's so big, and try to get this in your head, to get him from the ship to shore, they create some kind of a basket, and they derrick him from ship to ship until they actually get him on shore. And he begins his negotiations with Governor Douglas of the British Columbia territories. Now, when Rear Admiral Robert Bain arrives with his ship, he's ordered to start the war, essentially, and he refuses the order. And he says something to the effect, I think it's verbatim, he says, "I'll not fire a shot that'll start a war between two great nations over a squabble over a pig." So he refuses the order. And generally in a military environment, when you refuse an order, I mean, that's the end of your career. You're court-martialed. In this case, when this thing's all over, said and done, he returns to England. He receives a knighthood. And it's actually mentioned that through his calmness and discretion during the pig war, he gets a knighthood out of it. Anyway, back to Winfield Scott negotiating. He earns the name the Pig War Pacifier. And I'm not making this up. This is history. So he's sitting down with Douglas. They're negotiating. Finally, they agree to demilitarize, and Prickett removes his soldiers, and they move off. The American Civil War is about to break out, and that sort of ends it. But I think what comes out of that negotiation is they think, maybe this would be better solved with compass and map than with cannon and rifle. And logical minds prevailed there, or calmer minds prevailed, and we're going to finally see it established when, let's see if I can get this right, but both sides, after the American Civil War is over, still disputed territory. They both agree on a mediator from Germany, Wilhelm I, and he sits down and he assesses all the issues and the different property lines that have been drawn. And the real issue isn't the properties, it's so much as they haven't defined the water boundaries. If we think of the boundaries that run through our Great Lakes, Ontario, Erie, Michigan, we essentially divide them in half. Anyway, at the end of the day, he awards the San Juan Islands to the Americans. And since then, we've had an undefended border since. And I should point out that the only casualty in the making of this story is one dead pig. There was never a shot fired in the Great Pig War.